So thank you everyone for joining today. It's good to see you all here. We've got a pretty good turnout today by the looks of it. We have about 25 people. So that's nice. What we're going to go through today is basically someone's tax research that they've documented, put into a Word document. Um, I'll briefly give background on the scenario here so that when we're going through it makes sense. But really the topic is not the point of this session. The point of this session is to really focus on what has been documented and how it's been documented and basically how that can be improved to make the document a better document. So here's my lovely diagram where we basically got the situation we're dealing with is the taxpayer here is the employer of a employee. Haven't named this person, but let's just call him John. And let's assume that this employee is on a salary of £3,000 a month, just to exemplify the scenario that we're dealing with here. Let's say they pay £3,000 a month, and let's say that they should have had £1,000 of pay-as-you-earn income tax taken from that salary before it was paid to them. But let's just assume that that wasn't done in error. So the whole research scenario that we're looking at today in the documented research, it's to do with, well, this error's been made. How much now does the employer owe to HMRC as a consequence of that error? Is it £1,000 or is it what's called the grossed up tax on that thousand? So basically it'd be a bigger number than that thousand. But that's the scenario that's being researched and being documented. So what I've got here is it's been anonymized, but this is a Word document that the person who's looked into this created. So they're fairly new to tax, less than a year in. Currently doing their ATT exams just for a bit of context in terms of where they are in terms of level and grade and experience. And so they went away and looked into this situation, and this is what they've produced on the back of it. I'm going to give lots of different thoughts throughout. I'm going to give some feedback on where it could be improved. The point isn't to check whether the research is right or wrong. It's purely to do with like how well it's documented and what can be improved around that. So let's start off then. So they've given a nice heading to initially here to make the document clear. So it says payroll slash pay as you earn errors, involuntary disclosures. Do you need to gross up the tax due or not? So that was just what I talked about a minute ago. Is it the £1,000 that would be due or is it more than that? So they've got a background section and a current theory section. So let's have a look what they've said in here. They said we currently do not gross up the tax due when payroll errors are being disclosed to HMRC, but there has been some confusion as to why this is the case. Tax due for P11D reporting errors are grossed up in disclosures, so why is payroll treated differently? Colleague has looked into the technical position previously and said to start looking at Reg 80, Reg 67, and pay-as-you-earn regs on deductions to come to an answer. Okay, so this is quite a nice start to this because you open the document and you've got a bit of context and background in terms of what this document's about, where it's come from, etc. So it sets the direction well off the start here. So I'm liking that so far. We've then got there what they're calling their current theory. So what have they put here then? So they've said that it is the employer's obligation in the first place to deduct tax through pay as you earn, and therefore, as it was always the employer's obligation, there is no additional benefit to the employee if the employee settles less pays a tax due in the disclosure, hence no gross up required. Okay. So I think what they're basically saying here is this is their working theory. Like this is what they're checking to see whether this is right or wrong. So far so good. I like both of these sections. They give context to the document and they state very early on kind of the theory that they were working with. They then got a summary of findings, which is always a nice thing to have too, because you can see this document. It's not a huge document to be fair in terms of a research document, but it's 5 pages, so it's not short either by any means. So what they've said is that my conclusion is that the tax calculated when disclosing payroll slash pay as you earn errors to HMRC should not be grossed up. Okay, so they've concluded that it shouldn't be grossed up. So that is agreeing with the theory that they laid out. The amount of tax calculated in the disclosure should simply be the tax that would have been paid had the payment been processed through the pay-as-you-earn system correctly in the first place. Okay, so personally, probably what I would do here, actually, just as a note, is it's a good summary. It's a clear conclusion, right? I would have this in a slightly different section, just called conclusion or conclusion at a glance, something like that. So that's the main thing that we've kind of got as a consequence of this research, because then you've got the background, current theory, and you've got your conclusion on that theory, which is basically that the theory is correct. Then I would keep this section probably for what's going to follow after it. So let's see what this summary section says then. So they've said, so they've quoted some guidance here. So this is one of HMRC's manual. So pay as you earn 7001. And HMRC's pay as you earn manual confirms that it is the employer's responsibility to deduct tax from an employee's pay as you earn income in accordance with the tax tables and the employee's tax code. Okay, so it looks like we've got a bit of a summary just coming following this then. They've said that they've looked into a certain bit here. Which says where an employer could voluntarily opt to meet the tax NICs on an employee's non-deductible expenses, in which case a gross up required. This initially made me wonder if we should be grossing up such payments in disclosures, as in a disclosure, the employer would be paying the tax and NICs rather than this amount being deducted from the employee's gross payments. And therefore, there would be a benefit to the employee because they would have been essentially received a tax-free payment that the employer is now settling on their behalf. Okay, so this this here to me isn't what I would consider to be a summary per se. This to me is like the journey that they have gone on to get to their conclusion, which is a super useful thing to have, by the way. I would just set it out a little bit differently at this point. Um, I actually think so. I had a brief look at this earlier. So they've got their research section here as well, which is the next and the final section of this document. Because this is actually quite a complicated research task, which you'll see when we start looking through below, what I would have done in this case is laid out my whole kind of research and analysis in kind of the way that I went through the task in itself. So, for example, if this person started off by looking at the pay-as-you-earn regulations, Regulation 80, and some of the other regulations that they mentioned at the start of this, then I would start with something like initial research. I'd maybe call it something like that. The analysis section is the overall heading, subheading initial research, and it could say something like initially I went to look at the pay-as-you-earn regulations, Regulation 80, since that's where colleagues said I should start. I looked into that and I started branching out and looking into the other sections that were referenced by that regulation, something like that. And then what I do is start talking about my analysis of that regulation and what conclusions I was making and what I was thinking and why. And that way, what it's going to do is it's going to bring someone that's looking into this, like me or someone else that's reviewing it, it's going to bring them on the journey that they've gone on. One thing that's really hard, I think, when someone is doing research that someone else is going to review is being reassured and being confident that they've been thorough and complete in their research. And personally, for me, uh, bringing them on that journey, bringing someone like me on that journey, is going to make it easier for me to understand exactly what they've done, how thorough they've been, their thought process completely throughout. And I think it would just make it slightly in a more structured, logical way. So I looked through this summary section early this morning, and I like the fact that they've got a summary section. I just think their summary really, or the only key point they need to make at this point is that they've concluded this. They had a little bit of doubt maybe in terms of whether it was right because they found some things that were contradictory or potentially suggesting the opposite to their conclusion. And then I'd move into the in-depth technical analysis. Okay, so this research section. So when I had a look at this earlier today as well, this section is basically copied and pasted materials that they found within the pay-as-you-earn manual, which are these headings here. I think that's probably a subcategory of the pay-as-you-earn manual page. We've then got some quoting of legislation as well, by looks of it. Yes, it's quoted here. So what they've done is they've quoted word for word what I assume the useful pages that they found that's helped them come up with their conclusion. The only thing though is I have to assume that currently because it doesn't state clearly whether that is what they've done or not. I don't know whether they've looked into other areas that they haven't put in here. I don't know whether this is the only thing they've looked at, etc., etc. It's good that it's in there, but I think I need a bit more context in terms of what this research section is. And personally, I think it should be changed into analysis section. As someone that's looking at this document now and reviewing it, I will have to read basically all this guidance that they've quoted and essentially figure out for myself whether I agree with them. Whereas what they could do instead is they could say, I looked here, this is what it said, just quote the tiny small bit that they think is relevant. This is what it said, this is what it made me think or conclude. Next bit, I found this guidance, this is what it says, this is what it made me think and conclude. Whereas right now, it's much more difficult for me to. Well, I'm not really brought on their thought process journey. I have to read it myself and essentially make my own conclusions. They did put some comments in throughout, which I replaced with my comments here because I wanted to keep this anonymous, and which were helpful to be fair. That was them giving me their thoughts. But my problem now as a reviewer is there's an awful lot of information for me to go through and look at. And if that's the case to some degree, I might as well have done the research myself. Now, that's slightly exaggerated, admittedly. But when I'm reviewing someone else's research, I want them to tell me the answer they've got and how they've got there. But I don't want to have to reread everything that they've read, essentially. Quotes for sure. The other thing I'd say about this section is right now it's not 100% clear to me whether this is word for word what is from their guidance. And a way to symbolize, if that is the case, that it is 100% word for word, is to put it in quotation marks for a start. So whenever I'm quoting anything in a research document, if it's the legislation or it's guidance, I will always put it in double quotation marks. Personally, I'll also put it in italics as well. So I put it in double quotation marks. Let's do this just to show you exactly what I mean. I put this full thing here in double quotation marks in italics. So here's the quotation marks. Because this is showing that this is word for word. So I'm assuming that it is, but I'd have to go and check currently to figure out whether that's the case or not. I'd also indent it a little bit on the page as well. The formatting's messing up a bit there, but I would indent it on the page. And that's the way that I always quote things word for word to make it very clear that what I'm doing is quoting something exactly. Basically, I'll just need to fix the bullet point format in there, but you get the drift. It gets indented on the page. What can be done then as well, which couldn't be done currently, is the person who's done this could then weave in their thoughts within the main body of the Word document. So what they did in this case, which isn't it was still helpful, but what they did in this case is they had the guidance quoted, they went through and they added their comments and their kind of thoughts were from different bits of this guidance that they read. But what they can do now is say something like, so after looking after looking at regulation 80 and the other useful or the relevant regulations in the pay-as-you-earn regulations, I decided to go and look at the at HMRC's pay-as-you-earn income, and you ought to get some further clarity and context. This page made me think slash conclude X. Here is what it said. And then you can put it in like that. And so what you can do then is every time they find something helpful, they're telling me that they've read something, this is what it's made them think and conclude, and basically here is why. So what can be done then as well is we don't need the full name, for example, um, of this manual page. So we could say maybe rather than this page earned 7,001. Maybe we can then just cut it down so that it says something like, whoops, here is what it said. An employer making payments of page earned income must deduct. So I don't think any of the other bits here are particularly relevant to them getting the view that they got out of this. So let's just shorten that for a second. So what we've done then is we've reduced the contents quite significantly. Rather than just regurgitating a large bit of information from somewhere else, which in this case is HMRC's pay-as-you-earn manual, we've got straight to the point, and it's very quick and easy for me to read, and also to kind of go through the thought process. So what they did here is they basically, this was their only comment on this entire guidance page, is they said that this bit here, this must deduct bit, because it says an employer making payments of pay-as-you-earn income must deduct or refund tax in accordance with. So they said that this supports that it is the employer's obligation to deduct tax from pay-as-you-earn income. So all the other bits that were in that page were not relevant in supporting the conclusion that this person reached, which is why I would just take it out. Otherwise, we just end up having our documents too long, too much information in it, and it's harder for someone else then to follow your thought process. But without basically reading it, sitting back and thinking which bits of this guidance page are actually relevant. I had to do that before myself, whereas the person could have done that already and already shortened it, if that makes sense. So similar point is going to then apply throughout the rest of this section. So again, we've got the quotes from the full page. I would again change the formatting. So one thing I didn't do here actually is just take that back. This is why I do the indenting, by the way, because then we've got basically my words here. That's clear that that's my words. We've got the quote, the italics, and the indentation to make it clear where I've quoted something. Again, so I think there's going to be a similar point here. They've got a lot of bits in this manual page they found which isn't relevant to the bit that they're talking about. So they've highlighted certain bits. So these are probably the bits that they think are helpful. But right now, so this is what this says. It says the page run regulation sets out how an employer who makes payment of page run income is required to deduct and account for tax. So that's highlighted. But what I don't know is why they've highlighted that. Do they think it's relevant? Why do they think it's relevant? Right now, without going and asking that question of them, I don't know that. I can assume or try and guess, but I don't know. So they can just remove that ambiguity by just telling me. This bit seems completely irrelevant, so that could be deleted and shortened. This section of the manual is concerned with the taxation and payments of pay as you earn income. Okay, so this page in itself doesn't look like it actually contains any helpful information in helping them reach their conclusion, which is why I assume that they've not put any comments on this section. So for me, this whole section would just go. There's two bits when you're kind of doing research. You've got your own research notes, which you will keep and make as you go along and through doing your research. But that's not the same thing that you will be sticking on the file necessarily and handing to someone else for review. So they've come across this page, they were probably thinking, oh, it might be helpful, it might be a bit, but then it doesn't really seem like it's being used to substantiate anything. So if that's the case, I'll delete it. Or if it is meant to be helping with a point, I'd explain what that point is that they think it's making or that they think it's helpful with. So I've just seen someone put a comment in the chat. They said, "Is it worth including a link to the relevant manual page so when clicked on, you can go straight to the page?" Yes, absolutely. They did actually do that with comments on the side. I ended up deleting them when I was going through this because it had their name on it. So they did do it that way. But yes, I would say so, and I would do it by highlighting it and then putting a link in through that so it's hyperlinked. Now, a good research document, though, I shouldn't have to, at least much anyway, click on those links and go and read these other places unless it's highly, highly relevant or I really don't know what they're talking about. But at least the link being there means it's very easy for me to then go and check if I want to go and check. But the relevant bits should just be quoted and put straight within the documents. The bits that aren't relevant don't need to go in there. And therefore, if you link stuff, what that can do is encourage people to go look at the full page, which is a lot of information to read. I'd still link it just in case the review wants to do that. But a good document, a good research document, you shouldn't have to go at least very often and look at the source material. There's different circumstances where that changes, of course. Right. Let's carry on anyway. So what have they done in this section then? So they've quoted something again, it looks like here. So I'm going to assume, by the way, this is laid out that this is all the same page, but not 100% clear to me right now about going and looking further because that heading is the exact same size as this heading. And so if that's part of the same page, I'd expect this to either be bigger and this to be smaller to just signify that. But again, that could be helped with the quotes that we've talked about before in the italics, etc. So they've got page run income, operation payments for page run purposes, how to gross up. Okay, so this does seem highly relevant right straight off the bat because of the fact that it's talking about grossing up. And our question basically is, do you need to gross up or do you not need to gross up when we're dealing with payroll errors? So they found something here that says there may be circumstances where employers agree to voluntarily meet the tax and primary class 1 national insurance contributions due on employees' non-deductible expenses. First thought is I don't know straight away exactly what is meant by that. I've got a good idea because I work in employment tax, but I'm not 100% sure what's meant by that. So I feel like further context is needed, and I'm not sure whether that's going to be in here at the moment. So it says, for example, when an employer wants to pay for the travel or accommodation cost for an employee traveling to a permanent workplace. Okay, so then what they've done in a comment is they gave me their thoughts about that. But what they could have done is built that within to the main body of the document and said something like, I came across this page which said this, quoted the exact quote that they want me to look at, said this made me think X, or this made me think Y, and this is Y. Essentially, without reading this word for word, essentially what it says is that they thought that this could suggest that you do need to gross up, but they've still concluded that the right answer is to not gross up payroll errors. But when I looked through this morning, I can't remember seeing something that basically said, well, this is why, whilst I thought it might suggest that, this is why I don't think that's the right answer. So there's almost like a missing link in terms of why they disregarded this currently, or why they concluded that it wasn't relevant in our circumstances. I know why it's not relevant in these circumstances because I work in employment tax as well, and I've done this research myself before, but this research document itself doesn't currently explain that. Okay, so that's going to come to one of the points I'm going to make then actually around this. So one of the gaps I think there is in this research document personally is that basically there's some terminology and there's some things used where there's a question in my mind like, well, what does that mean? Or what is the answer to that? Or have you checked something? And so what needs adding basically is something that addresses those points. So if I was reviewing this now live, like properly on the job, I would go through and add my questions basically and send it back to them to go through those questions. But what they can do as part of that process is anticipate what questions might be raised, and questions will usually be raised where something hasn't been like seen fully through from the start all the way to the end. So right now, this terminology is being used, but what is being meant by it, for example? So that needs to be explained in this document somewhere, and referenced as to why that is the case. Again, how they've concluded that. So let's just have a look a little bit about the legislation that they quoted. So it's kind of an overall comment. What I think they should do differently is rather than just quote all the guidance and all the legislation in like one big chunk, like what they've done here, is it should be weaved in throughout a technical analysis that says, this is what I've done, this is what this says, this is what I've concluded on the base of that, or this is what I did next because of that, etc., etc. So talk me through the steps that they've gone through. Currently, I don't know exactly those steps, and so I don't know whether they have considered certain things or haven't considered certain things. I can just see the bits that they put in this document, basically. So they've quoted this lead. I'm not going to go through this word for word because this is written complicatedly, but they've put a few comments on throughout. So let's talk through some bits where I think additional bits need to be done. So they've quoted this reg here. It says this regulation applies if it appears to HMRC that there may be tax payable for a tax year under Regulation 67G, which has been highlighted, as adjusted by Regulation 67H, which I'm going to highlight just now as well, just in a different colour. So where appropriate, or 68 by an employee which has neither been paid to HMRC nor certified. Da, 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 da. Right. So if I was reading this, doing this research myself, to make sure that I fully understand exactly what this regulation is saying, I would go and look into every single one of the regulations referenced here. So I'd look into regulation 67G, I'd look into regulation 67H2, I'd look into regulation 68. And the reason for that is until I go and check and look it up, I don't actually know whether it's relevant to the research task that we're doing or not. And because I found a relevant regulation, which is regulation 80, I need to make sure that I understand that in full and everything else that's been referenced. So they've done that a little bit here. So they referenced 67G, but that's the last one. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, has this person checked regulation 67G? Have they checked regulation 67H? Have they checked regulation 68? Have they checked all these regulations? Because if they haven't, then my question is, well, are they relevant? And right now, they might know the answer to that question because maybe they have checked, but it's not stated in this document, I don't think, that they've done that. So I don't know without asking them. So the document currently isn't what I would call self-contained, if that makes sense. It'll be self-contained if it said something like all these regulations were referenced in Reg 80. I went and checked all of them. This one's not relevant for this reason. This one's not relevant for this reason, etc., etc. And so then I can see that they've considered every bit of that. The reason why I think in this one in particular they need to be so thorough as well is because this seems to be a complicated task in that it seems like there is some potential disagreement or misunderstanding at some point. it seems like there's no clear conclusion made in that they have some doubt as to whether they're right. I don't think they're 100% sure based on this that they've come to the right answer. They've come to a conclusion with reasons for that, but I don't think they're 100% sure on it, which tells me that it's a complicated task. And whenever we have a complicated task, we automatically have to like dial in terms of being really, really thorough. And the way to do that is to go and check everything that's referenced and check everything carefully, basically. So that would need to be done. So I've just seen the time. We're not far from coming to quarter two. So I'm gonna just go through very briefly what I think is good from this document then, and also some improvement areas, just in summary. So we've talked through these a bit already. So in terms of the goods, I really do like the backgrounds, the current theory section, and the fact that they've got a really concise conclusion at the start. I think all those things are good. I do like that they've referenced legislation and guidance throughout as well. That's definitely the right thing to do in a research document, particularly one that's been being kept internally by a team. So that all those things are really good, and they've clearly found some relevant bits, right? They've found things that are relevant to the opinion. They've found relevant legislation. They've looked into relevant guidance. So I've got a feeling that they're being pretty thorough on this, and they haven't just tried to do like a quick job of this to get it out. They spent time thinking about it. In terms of improvement areas, I think this research section basically needs to be completely reframed to make it stronger. So I would call it probably an analysis section. The analysis section, I think, can then bring the reviewer or the reader on the journey of what this person's gone through. So, like, where did they start? Did they start in the page on regulations, Reg 80? Did they start elsewhere? What did they do and what motions did they go through? Because that can be explained. The reason that's good is it will show me how thorough they've been, and it will help me to see whether they've got any gaps, for example, and whether there's any other areas that they need to go and consider and think about. So I would do that. Um, Whenever there's a term used that isn't 100% clear in terms of what it means, I'd make sure that it's checked and explained, and that this document makes it clear that that's being checked and explained. Where a relevant bit of legislation, like Regulation 80, has been found, it's just going through and making it clear that the rest of the regulations referenced throughout this have been checked, and it's been concluded that they're either relevant or not relevant, along with a brief explanation as to why. And I would also just cut down the volume of the things that are being quoted here. So in particular, only quoting the bits that are actually relevant. So what you don't want to do is just obviously put in things that are supportive of the conclusion that you've reached. You still need to be balanced, but things that are helpful and unhelpful should be quoted in that context. But information that's not being used and isn't impacting how you've come to your conclusion just doesn't need to be here. It can just be taken out. And I suppose lastly, then going through the analysis section in that way, going on the journey, explaining like how you've reached a conclusion and why, along with reference and a quote, that would be really helpful. And as someone put in the chat earlier, linking throughout is good too. But this person did do that. I just ended up deleting them to remove their name from the document. Lovely. I then that's probably going to be it for the time that we've got. So I know it's quite heavy to go through something when we've got a 5-page document, but hopefully you've got some takeaways from that. I would say the big one is where something is complicated, make sure that you bring them on that journey and you make it very clear what you have and what you haven't done, along with reducing the information that hasn't helped you reach that conclusion at all. Shall we open up to questions then for people? So we have about 15 minutes for any questions that people have, and then we will close it off for the day. You can either ask questions through the chat function or you can unmute your mic and talk through that. Either's fine. And if you've got none, then it'll be an early finish indeed. No? That is the first time that we've had no questions. Maybe that means that you guys have no idea what I'm talking about. Oh, here we go. One's come in. So Will has said, in cases where it's complex and the answer isn't 100% clear or there's an ambiguity, how would you approach that? Do you just go with the likely option and document your reasoning? What I would do in that case, Will, is I would identify the ambiguities, so the bits that mean you can't be 100% clear or there doesn't seem to be a 100% definitive answer. I would make sure that I know what those are so then I can talk about them in the research document. So let's just say, I don't know, is there a bit in here that I could use as an example or something else I could use as an example? I don't know. Let's say that like there's a phrase or there's a word that's used in the legislation that could be interpreted in multiple ways. When you're doing the research, you've probably looked at that phrase and changed your mind in terms of what it means. So that phrase would go into the document and say, there's no, and say something like, I don't believe there's a 100% clear answer here because of this word in here, this word in here, this word in here, because this can be read to mean this. It can also be read to mean this. To try and help understand what this phrasing means, I've looked in HMRC guidance or in Kroner commentary or Tolley's guidance, and this is what it says. And so I believe that it's more likely than not, based on those points, that this is the answer. However, I've been unable to reach a 100% definitive conclusion because of these reasons and this point here. And that way, what you've done is you've acknowledged that there's that ambiguity, you've pinpointed exactly why you've got it, and you've explained what you believe the right answer to be with justifications. So hopefully that makes sense. No problem, Laura. Thank you. Oh, no problem, Holly. So you've said, is it a good idea to list any resources they have read that they thought would be helpful but weren't worth stating? Nothing of note to help in this instance. Yes, absolutely do that. So one thing that I think is really useful for the reviewer is to have a list of like all the resources you've looked at. Now, if you've looked at say hundreds of pages of things, listing every single page is going to be a really long and difficult task. So there's a way that you can shorten that. So let's say that you've looked at an entire chapter or entire part within legislation. What you can say is that I've read all of chapter 10 or all of part 3 and I've quoted just the bits that are relevant, all the other bits that are irrelevant because of X, Y, Z. I've looked in all of this in HMRC's page word manual. There was this contents page. I scanned down the whole heading list. I looked to see what might be relevant, what might not be. I looked at the relevant ones. I didn't look at the other ones. Something like that. And what that's going to do for the reviewer is it will make them feel reassured and confident that you've been thorough in the research. And then when they're looking at that list, they might go, oh, well, they clearly haven't looked at case law or they haven't looked at why. And then the person that's reviewing it can go, well, we need to look at that, or actually, we don't need to look at that if that makes sense. So yes, for sure, Holly, and that shows, all the places that you've looked to show that you've been thorough and complete in the research. So yeah, exactly for the reasons you've mentioned, Holly. Yeah, no problem, Will, as well. Yeah, it's a tough one. It really does depend on the research task. Having some level of like audit trail of the things you've looked at will always be helpful when documenting research, always. But you need to get the balance right between listing everything that you've looked at and why it was relevant or and why it wasn't relevant to the amount of time it's going to take you to do that. If you do all of your research online, you can, for example, use your browser history, and that will keep a record of all the pages that you look at. So you could easily download that and copy and paste that into a Word document to help with that point, for example. But you just need to be sensible about it. If you've done some really rubbish Google searches that have returned absolutely nothing, then I probably wouldn't document, for example, every Google search that I've done. But what I probably would do is say, I tried lots of different variations of this sentence to try and get a hit, and I could find no pages, and so therefore I think nothing exists. An example of where that might happen is let's say that you're looking for a particular definition of a word in legislation or trying to figure out what a phrase means. What you can do is lots of different searches to try and find if there is a precise definition of that. And sometimes you'll come back and there'll be no hits because there is no precise definition of that. But what you could do then is say, I went and looked for a definition of this phrase or of this word to try and find it. This is what I did. I looked here, I did this, I did that. However, I could get no search results on it. And so it seems that nothing exists. There's no particular definition, but obviously I'm not sure 100%. When something doesn't exist, you can't prove it. So you can't prove that there is an absence of something, for example. So all you can do is say what you've done to try and see if it does exist, and therefore why you believe nothing does exist on it. Hopefully that makes sense. No problem, Ikra. I'm just seeing if there's anything, any questions in your comment as well. It says, when we're making notes ahead of drafting, would you usually shorthand everything, or do you prefer setting up a layout in Word? I sometimes find it quite easy to get lost in detail. Yeah, what I personally tend to do, and my wife gets annoyed at me for this now, is I use paper. And so I don't, I think paper is useful for two reasons. First off, if you were going to copy things down like complete vertebrum and, sorry, verbatim, and have something word for word, that's going to take you ages to take down as notes. So it forces you to not write down everything for a start. So that will help you take down less detail for sure. The thing I also like about handwritten notes is rather than just write sentences and bullet points, for example, I can maybe draw a box around something. I can draw arrows or lines between things. I can go back and highlight things by hand and a bunch of other things. So, personally, when I'm actually doing the research, I prefer to take notes by hand. And then when it comes to writing up the document afterwards, then that's when I start putting the full detail in. But my notes will be good enough for me to go and get that detail. So it will quote, say, the relevant guidance that I looked at or the helpful guidance. It will quote the relevant legislation, so I can just go back and refer to it quite easily. But it is very easy to get lost in the detail when doing research for sure. That's why I reiterated the point a few times here about not copying and pasting the full guidance page, because by doing that, you're putting in a lot of detail and not all of that is going to be necessary. It will also make it more difficult, I think, for you to kind of get or easy to get tangled up in your own research if you've got too much detail. Because then when you're going back to review it later, it could just end up overwhelming you essentially. So yeah, personally, handwritten notes are the way to go so that it forces you to not copy and paste things word for word. Hopefully that helps. And also, one side note on the note taking point is if you're taking notes and you're essentially getting your own words down for something, you're having to process the information that you're reading to be able to write it in your own words. And so you're forcing yourself to have to understand it rather than just reading the words on the page, if that makes sense. And a really important aspect of research is not only reading something, but actually understanding it so then you can apply it. And yeah, essentially summarizing what you think something means is a way to force yourself to do that. It helps me to internalize what it is that I'm reading and make sure that I properly understand it. Lovely. So they're really good questions, people. Thank you for asking those. I will stay around for a few minutes now anyway, because we have got 6 more minutes for anyone that does want to stay around. But yeah, hopefully you found that helpful. I'll just quickly give a bit of an overview of the session, then just a reminder, and I'll just stick this on the screen as well. So what we went through in this session then is the documented tax research of another tax professional, along with ways that it could be improved. So documenting your research is just one step of my overall 5-step tax research process. And it's actually the last step, the one that you do after you've done research, found relevant guidance and legislation, interpreted it, applied it, and reached your conclusions. What are the other steps and how do you undertake these confidently and effectively? This is the entire premise of my tax research masterclass, which I've created so that you can tackle tax queries more quickly and easily. From the masterclass, what you'll get is you'll learn good places to start your research. You'll have improved confidence that you're doing the right thing when you're researching. You'll be less likely to go around in circles or get stuck going down rabbit holes, and you should procrastinate and worry less. One of the recent attendees actually said to me about a month after the masterclass that she was now easily answering queries that she used to defer to her colleagues. She also spotted a £2 million tax issue for a colleague, provided a solution, and her tax director decided to use her solution rather than her colleagues. And to her, that felt brilliant. Before the masterclass, she was thinking about leaving tax because of how she felt about herself when it came to tax technical. She was feeling stressed a lot, and particularly when it came to researching things. But since the masterclass, she's proved to herself that she can actually do it, and she now feels confident in her technical ability. She got all of that from the masterclass. So if you do want to become better at researching tax queries yourself and just improving your overall technical ability, the Tax Research Masterclass will help you do exactly that. So you can go to the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/TRM to get further details and to join the Tax Research Masterclass if you want to. The next one actually starts on the 18th of March this year. And I'll just put that link in the chat too in case the QR code isn't working for people. I will check with the person who created this whether they're happy for me to share it. But if they are, then I'm more than happy to. I'd say it's useful to look at just so you can see what the starting point was and you can make your own decisions in terms of what was good and hopefully make sense of my improvements, suggestions.